Hi everybody. The purpose of this video is to begin building an evaluation or an evidence table using a quantitative study. I just want you to know that I will be flipping back and forth between this evaluation table template and the article in itself, so hang in there. So this is the evidence table or the evaluation table that you will be using in your evidence-based practice course. Something that you might want to do is either print it out and kind of have it beside you so you know what salient points to pull out, or if you have a double screen, put it up there while you're reading the article. Something about the article is I always encourage you to read through it first just to get an idea of it, and then go back and highlight your salient points. I caution you with an abstract, make sure you read the entire article because it really gives you important information that you need to pull over to the table as well. So with your evidence table, the first column here is just a cut and paste. Put your authors in, no initials, the year, the name of the journal, and then the title of the article as well. Okay, so I want to go through the article till I get to, like, say, here. So we're going to go through and talk about this. So if I'm reading the abstract, right off the bat, I know we're talking about school-based interventions. I know we're talking about childhood obesity. I know the target population was around 4,000. And the group was grades 3 through 12. It talks about the data analysis, and this information right here tells me it's a quantitative study, especially when I look at these p-values. Qualitative studies, remember, about words, and quantitative studies are about numerals. Okay, introductions. Introductions to articles provide the background, the problem, and the purpose, so they're very important to read. This starts in at the national average for overweight kids. And then we drill down into the area that the researchers are looking at, which is Lockport, New York, and it tells us a little bit about the obesity standards or obesity status there. And it tells us that this is a low-income population, and they're talking about the physical education standards and things like that. So in the end, what this really tells me is that what these people want to look at is student weight status, and is it affected by the changes made to a health education curriculum. And then the purpose of the paper in itself, a little bit more specifically, is that it presents the results of their longitudinal study with this sample population. Okay, methods. When we look at design, this is where we want to know what type of research study it was. This is a quantitative longitudinal cohort study of weight, height, body mass, so BMI and BMI percentiles. This is their target population. They did get IRB approval, which is always important for them to mention. The sample in itself, this is important because not only does it tell us the N, or the number, but it also tells us a little bit more about them, and it gives us some demographics in a nice, not only in the narrative, but also in a nice little table. They talk about the intervention as well. So specifically they're talking about that this is a multi-level 3-year intervention, and it goes from 2007 to 2010, which is mentioned in the article. It's multi-level because not only do they address the curriculum as a whole, but they introduce physical equipment, PE equipment, and they also talk about nutritional aspect as well, and introduce some changes there. I put this here. This was just interesting to me. This is all their pre-assessment data, and it's just interesting to read and keep note. Okay, so let's go back to variables. When we talk about an intervention, we know that that is our independent variable. This is the variable of the treatment variable. This is the variable they are manipulating. But we also know from right here, these are going to be our dependent variables, because we want to know if this intervention, this new curricula, has an impact on weight, height, body mass, and our BMI and BMI percentiles. The two primary variables that we're really looking at are weight and BMI, and you'll find that as you go through the article. Height is needed. We also want to know if they grow, but height is needed because we've got to calculate this. So really, overall, what we're looking at is the weight status of these kids and the BMI. Okay, so those are our variables. I want to talk quickly about measures. The measures, height and weight, and they tell us what they are, and they tell us what scales, tools, instruments they use to measure them, okay? So they talk about this for height, And they talk about the digital scale for weight, and we know that we need those two measures to calculate the BMI. So let's go quickly back to the table. So we know the problem is obesity of school-age kids. And we really want to address this and see if introducing a new health education curriculum can address this weight issues, this obesity issues. So the purpose is, will the introduction of the new health education curriculum affect weight status of the school-age kids? And remember, I got that from not only the background, but even just right here. Okay, so we know that this is a quantitative longitudinal cohort study. It said it right there under design. We know it ran from 2007 to 10, so 3 years. And this is what they were specifically assessing. I didn't have to put that there. I just did. I could have put it over here. The sample and the setting, we know that they targeted 4,000 kids, 3 through 12, in a low-income district, but they ended up with an N of 2,259. And the reason, and that was explained in the article, is that these were the students who were present for baseline measurements and endpoint measurements. So that's how they got their sample, and that's important to mention. We already talked about the variables. We know the independent variable is the intervention, which is the extensive change to a new health education or to a education program. So that's the independent, and we know the DV is weight and BMI. Those are the two major outcome variables. And the thing to remember is the variables that you put in here need to match up with your findings, and we'll go over that in a minute. We talked about the measurements. The measurements were height, how it was calibrated, weight, how it was calibrated, and then, of course, the BMI. In other quantitative studies, you're going to be addressing reliability and validity, and particularly with reliability, you want to put Cronbach's alpha in there. But these are tested. These are time-tested measures, and we don't need to address that. That's a basic assumption that these are reliable and valid. Okay, let's go back to the article, and let's talk about analysis. So the analysis tells us that they use SPSS for statistical analysis. It tells us that they looked at BMI percentiles, weight status, and they looked at it per category, and they actually categorize them per the CDC, and it tells us a little more what they analyze, and that they use paired samples t-test, and I know that they use chi-squared because they addressed it in the results and they addressed it in the abstract. So I just want to mention that right here with data analysis. They did the SPSS, and they looked at weight. They examined it for an overall change from 2007 to 2010. They addressed the BMI percentile, and they categorized it per the CDC. So in the end, what they did with data analysis was descriptive analysis, which are percentages and percentiles. They did paired t-tests, and they did chi-square. So I talked about right here what types of tests they ran and what they kind of specifically looked at, okay? So let's go back to the findings or the results. Again, this is our sample population, and this is all descriptive. I put that little note for me. This is all their descriptive analysis. They're telling you their percentages of like each category of kids and things like that. But I'm not going to pull that over. I want to know about my weight and my BMI specifically, and the statistical test I identified and how that impacted the findings, okay? So I highlighted this information. They did a paired samples t-test, and they found, and they were looking at the BMI, a decrease in the mean BMI percentile, and they found it was statistically significant post-intervention. They did a chi-squared test as well, and they looked at weight status change over the 3 years, and they categorized the kids per the CDC, which they talked about, categories which they talked about above, but they also found a statistically significance as evidenced by this p-value in this weight status as well. Now look, these are both of my primary variables, the BMI and the weight status, wherever that was. There we go. They also additionally did other paired samples t-test on the BMI, and they just looked at, it's a little bit different. They just had a different equation. They looked at weight status stratification, but they did find that there was a statistically significant change in that as well. I'd explain this a little bit more, but we just don't have the time. So anyways, they go through this, they talk about it, and then they look at the national trends as well. But again, the most important thing is that I put these two as my major variables, so I need to address these over here in this findings section. So overall, the weight status was improved with intervention. That was the overall thing that we really found. They did the paired samples t-test. They found a statistically significant decrease in the BMI percentile post-intervention. The weight status, they looked at chi-squared tests. They found a significant difference as well with post-intervention. They did another paired samples t-test on the BMI percentile. This is where they looked at the weight stratification in the article, and it was statistically significant decrease post-intervention as well with a p-value of this. Remember, our p-value should be less than 0.05. And then I just put the national trends in there if you want that as well. Okay, so appraisal of worth. Here's where we look at the strength and limitations of the study, risk or harm of the intervention, that should be of the intervention, and feasibility for practice. Your article, or the article, should always talk about limitations in any study. That's very important to identify them. The discussion, the summary, these are really important. They usually hold a lot of meat to them. This is a short one, but it's still very good. It just talks about how the weight status improved over a 3-year time period with their intervention. And they go into things a little bit more. So let me go back to limitations. They did not, this was not a randomized controlled study, so that's always, well, you can't always do RCTs, but it is a limitation, and like we could consider it as a limitation. This was a multifaceted approach, meaning they not only did they implement curricula in itself, they implemented new physical equipment and new nutritional guidelines and things like that. So they weren't able to really, the way the study was set up, they weren't able to truly determine which aspect of the intervention contributed to most of the success, or most of these kids losing this weight. And they could have set the study up a little differently to achieve that, but it's hard to do that if you don't have the money or the time. And then they talk about the significance of the study. So really, appraisal of worth. I just mentioned some limitations. No control population, not a big deal. They admitted it, They mentioned that right up front. Can't always do RCTs. It was a local setting, so we know that, but can we generalize it? Yeah, we probably still can. The biggest thing here is it didn't measure which actual intervention or piece of the intervention really made a difference. So that's actually could be another future study. Somebody should differentiate those things out. Clinical significance. What this means is, can you use this in your practice? And what I mean practice, can any of us use this, like let's say you're a school nurse, can you use this information? And I think definitely it showed statistical significance, but just looking at this, changing the the health ed curricula, yes, it probably could very much help any population in the world. Now this is level of evidence, the ratings, so I use the AACN level of evidence, and it's a level C, which you guys know about from your previous modules. Okay, so that's the quantitative in a nutshell, and then we're going to move on to QI.